I'm Jamie Kabler. I'm here at the Rancho Mirage Public Library and Observatory, California's finest library. We're very honored. It's the home of the Rancho Mirage Writers Festival. And today is a very special day. It's a publication of Pulitzer Prize-winning MSNBC contributor Jon Meacham's new book, which is called The History is Marching On, John Lewis and the Power of Hope. Now, we're going to be joined by Dr. Eddie Glaude from Princeton, a distinguished professor who has written a new book that's been out a couple of weeks on James Baldwin's America. So today we're going to have a great conversation. It couldn't be more timely with the Republican convention going on and with events in Wisconsin. So I want to welcome to both of you from your home in Nashville, Jon Meacham, to Eddie Glaude from a home in Princeton. Welcome to the Rancho Mirage Writers Series, sir.
Pleasure. It's a pleasure to be here. How are you, John?
I'm here.
I see you. I see you. It's great to have you. Oh my goodness, we just lost. Oh, there we are. So how you doing, my friend? Congratulations.
Well, you know, I'm always better when I'm with you and Jamie, mostly Jamie.
Yeah, I want to thank Jamie. Thank Jamie for this opportunity for us to be in conversation. And given what we just experienced yesterday with Jacob Blake and the horrors, it makes sense that we would take up the extraordinary legacy of John Lewis in this challenging time that we find ourselves. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation about this saintly figure, as you rightly describe him, and what we have to learn from what we can glean from the example of his life, right?
Right, right. And I think one of the things that we should warn everyone in Rancho Mirage is we are friends. It will seem passive aggressive and frenemy-like, but I promise. And I have learned important things from Eddie that I will confess only here. No, we're off the record, right, Jamie? And I have saved the texts where Eddie has admitted that he's learned something from me. And so I have the record, but I'm delighted. And I want to talk about Baldwin too. You will, Eddie is slated, if you all have us in the desert, he's slated to come out there. He will join me out back for the cigars, where Jamie lets me smoke against the law. So I'm hugely grateful for that. And I should tell you, I hate book festivals. And this one's great. So it's a great venue and a great community. Look, John Lewis is, I believe, an American saint. I believe that he meets the classical tests of being willing to die for a cause larger than himself that was based on love. That does not mean he was perfect. It doesn't mean he was without sin. Quite the opposite. There's a reason saints are sinners and not saviors. And I think it's important to make that point. But what's really important is not that we could all be saintly, but if we could all just aspire a little bit more to head down that road. I think that's what John would appreciate as well, and what he lived for, really. You know, he lived very much in the public eye. And I've thought a lot about this. You know, he became John Lewis because of innate experiences, because he was born in Troy, Alabama in February of 1940. He saw the segregation signs, he lived it. The only white guy he ever saw with any regularity growing up was the mailman. He hated going into town because he felt different. But he also encountered the story of what was unfolding beyond Pike County from the media, from the stories. So he heard Dr. King on the radio. He read about Autherine Lucy. He saw the pictures of Emmett Till. He understood in an intuitive way that his chapter was part of a larger story. And that was true in the Black Freedom Movement of the 1950s and 60s. But I'd argue that it is true of the American Reform tradition. And if the American Reform tradition is to have any efficacy and be defensible from people like me, we have to deliver. That tradition has to deliver. And it was folks like Jon who have long called us to that work. And he led with his head. You know, Bernard Lafayette told me somehow or another, the troopers always knew where to hit to get Jon in the head. And, you know, you knew this, Eddie, you know him, you were around him, and it was this quiet, persistent charisma. Yeah. And my other point in doing this is, I don't think we have to separate church from state, but we can't separate religion from politics. And so if you're gonna have faith-based activism, let's have his kind, without mentioning certain people who are in the news this week. Let's have the John Lewis way and actually see if the common sense implications of the gospel can lead us to a better, fuller, fairer, more just world.
Let's stay right here for a quick second. I mean, so we get the personality, the life that is John Lewis, the life that he lived.
Yep.
And then we have this one motivation driving the writing of the book, and that is to think about religion and politics, church and state in a very specific way, to commend a certain relationship between those two, over and against another example that we might say a bit about. But what was the most challenging aspect for you as a biographer in approaching this particular subject? Not only because John Lewis was alive for a period, but
right.
Then he fell ill, cancer began to attack his pancreas.
Right.
And you knew, and something similar happened with the biography with George H.W. Bush as well.
Yeah.
So what was the challenge, the principal challenge you faced in writing, in the mechanics of writing such a biography?
The first thing I've learned is I should probably choose younger subjects so it doesn't keep happening. So that's one thing, or have them already be gone. The challenge was to find the complexity, the shadow as well as the light, because this is hagiography, because hagiography means a life of a saint. And hagio in Greek means sacred or set apart, holy. And so I cop to that. If you're looking for warts and all here, this is not the place. But I couldn't find any warts. I would have written about him. Not that he was perfect. He held a perennial grudge against Stokely Carmichael. John hated that he lost the chairmanship of SNCC in 1966. He never got over that. He could be hyperbolic. You know, he played the Bull Connor card a couple of times rhetorically in Congress in a way that, you know, he probably shouldn't have. But if you're me, are you going to gainsay John Lewis that? Because what I didn't just want to give people a stained glass window or a statue, because we have plenty of those. But what I did want to show was, here is this person who was respirating and bleeding and sweating and working in our time, in our lifetimes, in tune with the largest of all human dramas. And what he would tell you, and what I believe, is if he could do it, then we should be able to do some part of it. And that's the point of, you and I talked about this, William James and the saintly character, right? It's not that you're removed from human experience, quite the opposite. Is that you yourself shape that experience. And so that's the complexity. I'd known him for 28 years, I realized. Met him when I was 22 years old or something. Had been honored to talk to him from time to time through the years. We had a running debate about whether the world was perfectible. And I said no, that you could not bring about the beloved community, the kingdom of God on earth. He and Dr. King disagreed with me. Dr. King and Lewis tend to win arguments with me. So I'm not hopeful in my chances. But it fascinated me that a man who bore the scars of that many beatings and had been arrested 45 times, had been to Parchman, the Mississippi State Penitentiary that William Faulkner called Destination Doom, that he kept the faith not, and this goes to something you and I debate all the time, John Lewis didn't believe in a more perfect union. He believed in a perfect one, and that it would be in harmony with the kingdom of God. You know, when Christians pray, thy kingdom come, most of us don't understand what that means. But what it means is you're praying for time to end, for there to be a breakthrough from heaven, which means God's space, into time, and that there will be a reign of justice, and the Amos line about righteousness like a river and justice like a mighty stream. John Lewis, who was with us until 6 weeks ago, thought that could happen. And I wanted to know, and we talked a lot about it, I wanted to know how and why. And it goes back to Jim Lawson, the Reverend James Lawson, probably the most important American not enough people know about, I think. If I were a better person, I'd write a book about James Lawson. He was, for those of you who don't know him, he was the son of a Methodist minister. He himself was a Methodist minister, conscientious objector during the Korean War, was jailed for refusing the draft, gets out of jail, goes to India. Gandhi had died, but he knew Gandhi's lieutenants, and he learned the tactics and the strategy of nonviolence. Howard Thurman had come earlier as well. And so there was this African-American encounter with the Indian experience. And he brought it back. And he runs into Dr. King at Oberlin one day. And King says, "You're what we need in the South." And so Lawson, working for the Fellowship of Reconciliation, moves down to Nashville and starts teaching Tuesday night workshops at Clark United Memorial Methodist Church, about 8 miles from where I'm sitting in the basement. And guess who wanders in? John Lewis, James Bevel, Bernard Lafayette, Diane Nash.
Diane Nash.
And the rest is history.
The rest is history. You know, it's really fascinating. I want to stick a little bit with drill down a little bit more in this theological position of Lewis, because on the one hand we can describe him as a saint.
Yep.
There's also this kind of literary archetype that we could use, right? That is, he's almost like a holy fool, right? You think about the holy fools in Russian literature, or you know, these folks whose willingness to risk everything in the face of what seems to be insurmountable odds. In their willingness to risk everything, they reveal a certain kind of wisdom. And he seemed to be a member of a cadre of holy fools. Yeah. When you think about Diane Nash and James Bevel, and talk a little bit about, you know, you do a lot of work showing the relationship, the importance of King to the formation of John Lewis. What is the relationship of Lewis to those other young activists, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee? Because it seems to me they are as important to his formation as King, at least as I'm reading the book.
They are fellow disciples, and I don't mean that in a patriarchal way, right? There was a nonviolent philosophy. That was the creed. The creed was the gospel plus Gandhi, right? To put in the face of segregation. King was the catalyst. John Lewis became aware of Martin Luther King over the radio, 1955, 56. He goes to see him when he's 17 years old. John Lewis wanted to try to desegregate the local state university. Because he was underage, he had to get his parents to sign off on the lawsuit. And the Lewises had a lot of kids, and life was precarious. And it was Troy, Alabama in 1957, and Little Rock had just happened, and Autherine Lucy had just been chased out of Tuscaloosa, and Emmett Till was dead, and Willie Edwards was dead. and Racy Taylor had been raped, and they were just no. And so we went back to Nashville. What Diane Nash and James Bevel, who were later married, Lafayette, Marion Barry, Julian Bond, Stokely Carmichael, so many others, Charles Malden, they were his brothers and sisters in arms in every sense, except for the armed part. And I think, Robert Coles did a great study of Freedom Summer, the psychiatrist, I guess. And Coles came away thinking that basically when he talked to volunteers from Freedom Summer, which would be true of the broader movement as well, he was talking to combat veterans because of the constant threat of death, the uncertainty of the surround, and the bonds formed among the soldiers. And it's not that surprising, actually, that while they shared a deep bond in the moment, life drove some of them apart, right? Julian and John end up running against each other in a brutal campaign in Atlanta in 1986. But in that moment, there's a great definition of friendship. C.S. Lewis has it that we picture lovers face to face, but friends side by side. Their eyes look ahead. And when you have that common experience, you're there, right? We all know that. We all have friends in college. We all have friends here that we adored and had done anything for, but life and circumstance have moved on. And that happened to Lewis a bit. Let me ask you, because of this perfectibility question. So everybody should know, Eddie and I debate this because we're really exciting. We tend to do it on Saturday mornings on text because we're cool and no one else will talk to us. So that's important. That's important to remember. But talk about, because you talk about it in your amazing book about Baldwin and who we are now and who we should be. Talk about the more perfect union and the drama of your critique of the idea of progress.
Yeah, so, perfectionism, when it's tethered to a certain kind of state imaginary, can serve as a kind of ideological cover for the ugliness of our practice. That yes, we have done X, but we're always already on the road to a more perfect union. So it's an ideologically efficient way of pushing aside, right, the ugly features of our character, of our national character. Or to invoke a metaphor of William James again, is to ignore the bitterness at the bottom of the cup. And so there's a sense in which instead of us talking about a more just society, right, to talk about a more perfect union, allows us to kind of avoid and evade the past in certain sorts of ways, because we're a past dodging civilization in interesting sorts of ways. We're always future oriented. And by virtue of that, there's certain parts of our story that we leave aside that then distorts and deforms our conception of justice. Because I want to suggest that who and what we leave out of our stories actually reveals the limits of our conceptions of justice. So I'm very weary of certain kind of perfectionist tropes and how they, because like you, I don't think it's possible.
Right.
Because I'm much more of a tragic figure than John Lewis in this sense, right? I don't think it's possible because I always want to lead with the fallenness, the failure, the dark side. And then from that, we imagine a better way of being in the world. But I'm very skeptical of the more perfect union talk because I think that's a way of protecting America. This is at the heart of Shining City on the Hill.
Right.
This is at the heart of the Redeemer Nation. This is at the heart of a certain kind of how can we say, evangelical nationalism that can get us into all kinds of trouble.
Right. But your alternative, and that has moved me through the years now. But you do believe in progress.
Yes.
Right.
And not in any guaranteed sense.
Right.
Right. So
Right.
it's not that we're moving linearly. The progress, as I put it, Baldwin will state that human beings are at once miracles and disasters.
Right.
And so
I'm still waiting to become a miracle. So that's good.
you aren't the only one. But given that, if that's true, then wherever human beings are, we have a chance.
Right. Right.
Because even though we may be the cause of the disaster, we can actually be miraculous in certain moments. And this is how one could read the Civil Rights generation, the Black Freedom Movement generation, for example, right, or however we want to describe the greatest generation of the country, right? That human beings exhibiting a kind of courage, a kind of character, virtue that we thought was unimaginable in some ways. So given that we can be miraculous, there are moments of extraordinary growth, but there's no guarantee.
Right.
So our faith in progress isn't that it will my faith in progress isn't that it will inevitably happen. My faith in the potential of progress rests in my faith in us.
Right. Right. And so one of the things that I find really compelling is, and one of the things I've tried to urge Vice President Biden and others to say is when they say this isn't who we are,
yeah.
The hell that's not who we are.
Yeah.
Now we can talk about who we should be and who we want to be, but of course it's who we are. And it's why no single election is ever quite as determinative as we think, because the forces ebb and flow.
Right.
And what amazes me about John Lewis is his steadiness of faith that, and he would disagree with you, his steadiness in a sense that, in fact, if we could preach the gospel enough, if we could tell the story enough, if we could drag ourselves to do the right thing, that it's more than a ripple of hope in RFK's formulation. It would be a tidal wave of hope. And he got to the very end. I interviewed him into late May, maybe late June, mid-June. And to the end, he was insistent that, and this is after George Floyd, that there was hope, that there's always hope. And what he would say when pressed on it, which I did, I said, well, how can you have hope with this? And he said, well, come walk in my shoes. I was born in a segregated world, and now I'm a senior member of the United States Congress. That is a story. That is movement. It's not all the movement, but one of the things I find so interesting about this moment, and I suspect many of our friends here do too, is this, to me, fascinating moment where liberalism, as a broad phenomenon, not red, blue, but the emphasis on the individual, the emphasis on the rule of law, is actually under attack from both sides, right? You have people on the right who are following this cult of personality, who simply want to use the tradition to amass power and hold on to it. And then you have a lot of folks who are our friends who believe the Union is so corrupt, the Constitution and Garrison's formulation was a pact with the devil, and it can't be redeemed. And it kind of leaves, I don't want to drag you into this, but it kind of leaves folks like me a little bit in the middle, because I do believe in the American project. I do believe in the Enlightenment project. I don't think it's all we can use, but right now it's what we've got. And I think liberalism itself is under immense stress and strain. And I'm trying to, and one of the reasons I wanted to do this book is to talk about it in human terms. Mm-hmm. Because John Lewis believed in America. He believed in reason and faith and the combination of the two. and never rested. And he led with his skull in a way that almost no one else did.
Yeah.
So, I mean, are you pessimistic? Are you optimistic? Where are you?
Well, I get my formulation from Du Bois's Souls of Black Folk. It's a hope, not hopeless, but unhopeful.
Ladies and gentlemen, that's what happened at Princeton. That's what they talk. That's the way they talk at Princeton.
It's a blues so dope. I mean, because you think about it, the Enlightenment idea, the Enlightenment ideal is already coming from the vantage point of the tradition out of which I come, is already under question, right? So because we're denied the capacity of reason, right? Black folk aren't extended autonomy because we're treated as means to someone else's ends, which is the definition of what Immanuel Kant would call heteronomy, right? So we're actually used instrumentally. So the very notion of the Enlightenment is predicated upon a whole host of anti-Enlightenment actions, right? So it's like John Adams purportedly saying to King George in this moment, "We will not be your Negroes." So at the very moment in which he's giving voice to an idea of freedom, it's predicated upon this intimate understanding of unfreedom. So the idea of the American we is always in my mouth and to my mind and in my heart. It has these dual inflections. One is descriptive, which means I'm going to point to all of the contradictions and the fractures, and the other is aspirational. Right? And it's always trying to keep those two things together. But I came across this passage in your book at the end of chapter 6, because I'm wondering, because you're right, it's hagiography. I get that, right? But there are a couple of notes. There's one about his exhaustion after Freedom Summer in Atlantic City.
Yep.
And he leaves. But then it's this passage at the end of chapter 6, you write, Lewis understood. He didn't like it, but he understood. We're only flesh, he said 2 years after Bloody Sunday. Quote, I can understand people not wanting to be beaten anymore. The body gets tired. You put out so much energy and you saw such little gain. Black capacity to believe white would really open his heart, open his life to nonviolent appeal was running out. This sounds like a moment of doubt, a moment of despair.
Sure.
Because, at every turn, he's risking his life, putting his head on the line. And what is he experiencing? Raw terror. Talk a little bit about how John Lewis grappled with the darkness and the disappointments of betrayal.
In the same way Mother Teresa did, right? I mean, without faith, without doubt, there's no faith, and vice versa. No, he went into exile from 66 to 88. There is this biblical trope throughout his life. He was not John Lewis when he grew up. He was Robert Lewis or Bob. And then when he went to the Holy Hill in Nashville, his seminary, which looked out over segregated Nashville, so he went to a mountaintop and was renamed in the same way Abraham and Elijah and Peter were. He experienced biblical exile. His family was uneasy with him when he was in the movement, which is very much part of the biblical tradition. And he certainly wandered in the wilderness and was tempted to give this up because of all the things. I mean, you and I are having this conversation now while Kenosha, Wisconsin is on fire.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
And next week it's going to be someplace else. And next week, and then it's just, that's one of the things that's sort of dazzling to me, is not that he doubted, but that he believed. And one of the reasons I wanted to write this is I don't know where I would have been if I had been born in 1939. I was born in 1969. I like to think I would have been on the right side, but I have no idea. And in this particular moment, I think I know where the right is. and at least I got it right this time.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you think though that a certain story of John Lewis, we've talked about this before, I think, that a certain rendering of him actually works to constrain our imaginations in certain ways, that so we lift him up in a certain sort of way.
Yeah.
Right. Whether it's Sean Mullenz's piece, I think it was in the New Republic,
Yep.
The Last Integrationist.
Right.
And, the context of that piece, of course, is the march, the Million Man March, the critique of his colleague Cornel West and the like, that he becomes an exemplar of what constitutes legitimate forms of Black political dissent.
Right. One of the things I worried about, and you're alluding to, and everybody should know, I called Eddie when I started this and said, I want to make sure that I'm not a white guy who's found the one Black guy of whom I can approve. Because that's sort of Eddie just gave you a Princeton Morehouse well-wrought urn, but that's what I said. And that worries me. But what redeems the project, I think, in the broadest sense, is all of this happened. And you can take it or leave it.
That's right.
Because I'm not elevating John Lewis at the expense of Ella Baker or Diane Nash or anybody else, or any other form of Black political protest or any form of protest. I believe, this is more personal than you asked, but, to whom much is given, much is expected. I am a very fortunate figure. I can spend the work of my days pretty much doing what I want so far. And so how do you invest that time? How do you spend that capital? And I have an opinion about John Lewis, and the world can take it or leave it.
Yeah.
And, it's not a full biography. It's a portrait of the movement. Some people may want a book about his congressional career. God help you if you do, but go ahead. But I defined my mission. I think I executed it, because my mission was, I'm going to explain to you what the religious ideas were that led to his righteous action. And if one person comes across this argument and says, he did something brave, in my own way, I'm going to try to do something brave, then it was worth it. And I don't think there is such a thing as a definitive biography. This is all an argument without end. And I started this before the questions of systemic racism were quite so front and center. And I'll tell you this, and you and I talked about this on TV, I think. One of the things that really surprised me in the coverage after his death was how little conversation there was about the fact that John was out of fashion starting in 1966, right? He embodied a form of protest that what did not seem to be durable or effective once Jim Crow and the Voting Rights Act were passed. And so he loses the chairmanship of SNCC to Stokely Carmichael in May of 1966. Dr. King was a lonely and depressed figure when he was in Memphis with Jim Lawson in April of 68, because Lewis and King were seen as these Sunday school piety purveyors, and they weren't chic. And I was really surprised, actually, that almost nobody said, I think you and I said it a couple of times, nonviolence was not universally accepted in real time. And so I think let me put it this way. This book is my honest view of this man. And I loved him, and I love what he represents. and maybe we can create a world that reflects just a little bit more of it.
Yeah. There's so many moments in the book that are striking, not only because of his example of courage and his willingness to live his commitment in the face of obvious danger, but there's over and over again in your use of example, demonstrative moments where the country is just simply failing.
Oh, my
Over-
region, mostly. Your region.
Yeah, you know what I mean? So over
Eddie
and
tries to, y'all
over
should
again.
know, Eddie covers this up. He's from Mississippi. You know, he likes,
Straight up.
he,
I'm a
he,
country boy from Mississippi. That's
he wears his, hood around, but he's really from Mississippi. All right, go ahead.
I mean, what did you do? How did you, I mean, because in telling his life, you have to tell the story of this moment. In figuring him as a kind of founding father of sorts.
Yeah.
You're actually figuring the civil rights movement, the Black freedom struggle, not just simply as a second Reconstruction, but as a kind of another founding of sorts. So how did you respond to this in the archive? You knew it, but as you were retelling his story, the repeated failures, the violence, the extraordinary cruelty
of
that
my people.
Yeah.
Right. I'm a white Southern, boringly heterosexual Episcopalian.
Episcopalian. I just want you guys to Episcopalian.
Eddie works at a Presbyterian place, which I don't understand, because if it's all predestined, what the hell's the point? Where's the fun in that?
Hey, you don't know. You don't know. You better keep acting like
Roll the
you do,
dice.
though.
Anyway, it's very much projection in two ways. It's personal projection, but it's also a little bit of presentism, because does any of this sound familiar? State-sanctioned white backlash to changing demography and the claims that we actually have to live up to what we said in terms of Nazis driving around Mississippi, George Lincoln Rockwell, in a hate bus during the Freedom Rides, Klansmen, white citizens councils, the language of resistance, defiance, states' rights, it's all there. And it was there a generation before me, and it is real now. Very much so. What are these murderous police shootings but state-sanctioned executions that tend to be racially based? It's what they are.
Yeah.
But Alan Thompson, the mayor of Jackson, Mississippi, during Freedom Summer, created a Thompson tank. Right? And there were these pickup trucks with repeating semi-automatic weapons that came out 3 or 4, because they thought during Freedom Summer they were just going to have to mow people down. Does that sound so crazy today? Right? So there's some presentism here. I mean, unquestionably. Look, the debate, I'll leave it with this, but the debate about which Atticus Finch is more real.
Yeah.
Right? Is it the Atticus of To Kill a Mockingbird, or is it the Atticus of Go Set a Watchman? Is it the noble lawyer, or is it the Citizens Council guy? Let me tell you what I knew more of when I was growing up. Is I knew a lot more of Go Set a Watchman than I did of To Kill a Mockingbird. And that is a painful reality. The other thing I sometimes get, and you and I have talked about this, particularly with Black students of mine at Vanderbilt, sometimes I will be asked how I can argue the efficacy of progress, or isn't it easy for me to argue the efficacy of progress? And I always concede it. It's why I say, look, if you look like me, it's worked out. But my strong feeling is if people who look like me don't make these historically based arguments, which is that not only is it the right thing to do, but we have always grown, we, the nation, have grown materially and morally stronger when the Declaration has actually been put into effect. And that's a clinical argument. It's not a partisan one. I say this to politicians all the time. Do you want to be Bull Connor or John Lewis? Do you want to be Joe McCarthy or Margaret Chase Smith? What are the moments in presidential history, to return to my main job, that trip off the tongue about moments of bravery? It's Johnson and civil rights, Lyndon Johnson and civil rights. It's Nixon going to China. It's Reagan and the Cold War. It's George Herbert Walker Bush resigning from the NRA after Oklahoma City because the NRA called federal agents jackbooted thugs. It's George W. Bush going to a mosque after September 11th and saying this is not a war against Islam. There are these moments where you take on your base of support. And what do all those moments have in common? All of those moments are about reaching out, not about clenching in.
Well, I want to remind the audience that they can submit their questions through the Q&A feature in the Zoom box. I think I've misdescribed it as Zoom box, but you can submit your questions there. We're going to turn to Q&A in just a few minutes, but I want to ask Jon a question that's tied to the biography, which is just wonderful. You're just gonna love it. Because he's such a beautiful writer and such an insightful thinker. But Jon, you had an opportunity. We both know that this election is perhaps the most momentous election that you and I have faced in our lifetime.
Yep.
And you had an opportunity to speak at the Democratic National Convention, and you chose to do so. And the ink was barely dry on this biography.
Right.
And of course, the soul of America looms in the background,
right,
of this biography, because in some ways, Lewis is an exemplar of one of our better angels. Talk a little bit about what was running through your mind, because it's such a powerful speech the other night.
Thank you.
And how were you channeling the lessons of your encounter with the past in that moment?
It's a great.
You were offering us something.
It's a great question. And I should also say that this book is sequential to The Soul of America, but it also benefited from your critique. And I hate to be nice to you in public, but I took on board your point that you made a few minutes ago about the myth of perfection. And one of the things I wanted to do with this was to show that I understand that the arc of a moral universe only bends when people insist that it swerve. So in the dialectic of history, you have to have John Lewis. And it's not inevitable that it bends that way. Mm-hmm. And so these two books are very much in conversation with each other. And it's basically just me muttering in the house, which is what I do anyway. The Vice President Biden called up and asked if I would do this. Honestly, the first thing I said was, I'm not sure I look like what you're trying to reach here, honestly. And he said, no, I want you to do it. He said, define the soul of America and do it quickly. It's actually sort of interesting for readers. For all the talk about the soul of America at the Democratic National Convention, nobody ever really defined it until Thursday night at about 9:30. And I define it, as you know, as an arena of contention in which our worst instincts and our better instincts do battle, so that it's never wholly redeemable on this side of paradise. So that speech which was about 650 words, which I'm embarrassed by because that's about 2.5 times longer than the Gettysburg Address, and I suspect a little less memorable, was very much about the argument about the soul in the sense of not making a political argument or not making a partisan argument, but making a historically based one. That we make a little bit of progress and then we fall back. It's actually kind of if you really look at it, and I worried about this a little bit, it's not particularly uplifting, right? I mean, I talk about segregation, Civil War leads to segregation, the New Deal to right-wing reaction, civil rights to white backlash, light and shadow, battle's never over. We fail and follow the commandment to love one another as we love ourselves far more often than we succeed. But. And I think that the magic of America, the potential greatness of America, which is also true, the potential greatness of people, lies in the but. Because we are still here. We are still fighting these fights. And Jon was very much in my head about this. Because, again, in our time, this giant moved among us. He never sold out. He didn't go to Wall Street. He didn't sit on corporate boards. He was, this, you could call him up into a year ago and say you were a high school in Cairo, Illinois, and you needed a commencement speaker, and he'd get on a plane and come. He did this for me and my wife once in New York and got on the shuttle. She was at Phoenix House, the rehabilitation center. They have their graduation for people who've recovered. Mm-hmm. And Jon got on the shuttle, this is 20 years ago, flies up, no staff, nobody. We pick him up at the airport, we drive him there, we drive him back. And, our audience knows a lot of important people. They are a lot of important people. And that doesn't happen much.
Right. So let's take a couple of questions from the audience. There's a question from Deborah Chu. And this is a question that we always get, I think. What would Representative Lewis or Jimmy Baldwin say about the event in Kenosha and the ensuing violence? Yesterday.
You do Baldwin. We haven't talked about Baldwin. You do Baldwin first.
Well, I think there's 7,000 pages of Baldwin, so I don't want to try to anticipate his words. We could just read his words.
And that one, everyone can just read Eddie's book, which is not 7,000 pages.
No, but I want to suggest that, from reading him, what he would force us to do is to really look at what is the source of the outbursts. There are all of these folks who cry for nonviolence, who aren't really committed to it first. That's the first thing. They demand nonviolence on the part of protesters, and they themselves aren't really committed to the philosophy of nonviolence. But the demand for nonviolence often happens before there's an attempt to understand what motivates the outburst.
Right.
So people who are dying at exponential rates because of COVID-19, folks who have lost their jobs, folks who are trying to make ends meet, and police are still killing folk indiscriminately. There's a provocative formulation that Baldwin had, and he said it to provoke on purpose. He said, and he was talking about policing in the United States. He says, we still live under the basic logic of the slave codes. And what he was suggesting in this moment is how Black bodies were perceived and valued. Mm-hmm. Because that's the only kind of way, at least for him, for us to understand why police reach for deadly force so quickly.
Yep.
And to do so in this moment, and I can imagine this is part of the motivation as well, not just simply because of the background conditions that I just described, But his 3 babies,
Mm.
3, 5, 8, were in the car when they shot him 7 times in the back. Baldwin wants us to understand the rage, that the rage is a product of us.
Mhm.
It's not wholly other.
Mhm.
That's what he was trying to say to folk in terms of understanding Black power, because I know I'm going on and on here, but the
No.
quick point here is that we tend to tell the story of the Black freedom struggle as if the civil rights movement and Black power were wholly different moments, when many of the folk who were the holy fools
Yep.
experienced raw terror and then cried Black power 3 years later.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It totally does. And one of the things I tried to do in this book is not fall into that trope, which honestly John kind of did. When you look at his memoir and he was kind of open to John Lewis versus Stokely Carmichael. And I agree with you. I don't think that holds up. Straight to the question, he would go and he would stand or sit and keep vigil and watch and bear bodily witness to the injustice. And it would frustrate people who want more vigorous action. Guess what? It frustrated people who wanted more vigorous action 60 years ago.
Indeed.
Malcolm X said about the March on Washington that it was too much cream in the coffee. And was not, at least the X until Malcolm until about 64, 65, right, was not a big fan of the King Lewis way of doing it. He moderated some toward the end, and as was evolving, and when he was killed. Evolving sounds as though he's progressing. He was just changing, that. So whatever form that would have taken. And I think, I don't know, where do you stand, Eddie, on what can politics and policy do, particularly on the Black Lives Matter, on this straightforward question about law enforcement? Because actually, unlike the broader issues, it seems to me there's a good bit that's actually actionable intelligence here.
Oh, absolutely. I think one of the things that we have to do is to get ourselves out of the frame of law and order. We know how old and what that frame how old that frame is, and what it has manipulated.
Yep.
To use that verb. Get out of the kind of binary of being hard and soft on crime, because it leads to kind of punitive approach. That the answer to crime, or the answer to social dysfunction, is to lock people up. I think we need to break the general frame. And how we do that involves, I think, really a broader conversation, I think, John, about a more robust public infrastructure of care, within which safety is thought of, right? And so I know some of us are getting caught up with defund the police, but when we operationalize it, when we unpack what most folk mean by that, they're trying to say we should budget according to what we value. If we don't want to just lock people up, then we need to address the policy decision to empty hospitals of those who were mentally ill in the 80s.
Yep.
We need to address the question of domestic violence we need to address, right, a range of things without the use of deadly force. So I think the low-hanging fruit involves decriminalizing the code, because you can sneeze in the United States and break the law. Demilitarizing the police. It's not just Jackson, Mississippi, as you described in Freedom
Yep.
Summer, but it's also Ferguson and recently. We can begin to talk about, qualified immunity so that police can be held accountable. Changing the frame. That's low-hanging fruit, changing the frame. But we got a whole bunch of questions here, John,
All right.
for you. Here's one. I want to make sure I get it. This is from Carol Addleston. I think she asked one of the earlier questions. What do you see as the next step to carry on the challenge Lewis left for us?
I think it's a lot of what Eddie was just talking about. I think it's addressing the central question, which is what can we do in the public sphere that brings reality closer into tune with the Great Commandment? What can we do to make gentler the life of the world? And that maybe it sounds gauzy, but after the last 3.5 years, I'll take gauzy right now. So I think it's restoring a sense. The language of restoration is tricky. I think it is living by a sense that we are stronger when we reach out, and not rewarding again and again a politics of narcissism and nationalism and excessive selfishness. Politics is always going to be selfish because it's about people and people are selfish. But there are ways to move that needle, if you will. John moved it. We should too.
There's another question from Susan St. Louis. Do you have any hope, John, that those folks who quote unquote look like you, whose minds are back in Jim Crow land, can somehow be changed ever? Or do we have to wait for new generations to understand that something like Black Lives Matter is not a hate movement? What do you make of this?
I think the answer it's a great question. I'm not in the business of giving up on people. That's the Lord. He's in charge of that. I don't think you can give up, because what we're called to do, whether you're religious or secular, is you're called to try to share the fruits of the reasonable process, hopefully, that you've gone through to reach a certain conclusion, right? Politics is the mediation of differences and the persuasion based on principle or circumstance. And, I live in a state where 80% of Republicans strongly support the president. Not just support, strongly support. And so, I'm not Pollyannish about it. I'm not Panglossian about it. But you don't have to win that many folks over to help make significant change. Think about this in America. Our 3 biggest presidential landslides in the last 75, 80 years have been 1964, Johnson versus Goldwater, 1972, Nixon versus McGovern, and 1984, Reagan versus Mondale. And the highest one of those numbers was 62%. So in the biggest moment, 38% of the country, 40% of the country disagreed. It's why I could never be a politician. I'm not built in a way where I could walk down the street and realize that almost every second person would want to fire me. I got enough problems. I don't need that. So this is not an 80-20 country. It's not a 90-10 country. It's not a 60-40 country. It's with structural partisanship. That's my new phrase, by the way. You're going to hear it more. Structural partisanship is such that if a presidential candidate in this climate gets 52 or 53%, that's the old 57, 58 because of the various tribal forces. So, but no, I don't think we can give up, because again, John Lewis, what was more reasonable? Eddie read that passage. What was more reasonable than giving up and waiting out the generation? Wait out Bull Connor, wait out Jim Clark, wait out George Wallace. he wouldn't do it. And we live in a better country because of that.
We only have a few minutes left, and I really want you to offer some summary remarks. But my thinking is, and it's a version of the same claim that you're making, but with a different accent, as always, right, Jon?
Mississippi versus Tennessee.
We spend so much energy trying to convince the 38% not to hold the views that they hold.
Yeah.
But oftentimes we don't have enough energy to build the world that we want to build.
Good point.
And it seems to me that those of us who are committed to a more just world, and we could disagree on some of the particulars, but those of us who are committed to building a more just America, we need to get about that work and force a choice among that 38%.
This is such a good point, because this is getting ahead of ourselves, but the best thing that will happen to Fox News is if Joe Biden wins the presidency, because opposition is easy and governing is hard. And it's so much more satisfying to feel self-righteous and look down at the benighted other than it is to actually build. And I think that's going to be a problem on the right and on the far left going forward. Because I think, moving into punditry for a second, if Joe Biden wins, whenever it's over, which will probably be sometime in December, I think the left is going to wake up the next day and say, wait, we just did all this for a guy from Delaware who eulogized Strom Thurmond?
Oh, absolutely. That's guaranteed.
I mean, so there's going to be this sort of, and I really think what you just said is really important, which is, and I think, and maybe this brings us to a good landing point.
Exactly.
That's what Lewis would do, right? Lewis did not just give speeches. He wasn't very good at it until later in life. But if you look at, and I'll leave you with this. This Friday is the anniversary of the March on Washington. And Harry Belafonte, name drop. I talked to Harry, who is the coolest man on the planet, and he's like 150, right? I mean, he's still cooler than you or I will ever be. And he said something fascinating to me that I'd never heard, which is, it's in the book. I know what Martin did that day, but let me tell you what the better speech was. And it was John Lewis's. Go watch it. Everybody should just go watch it on YouTube. It's about 7 minutes. There's this great moment at the end where, at the end of the speech, where Bayard Rustin, who's smoking and leaning in, and I asked Congressman Lewis, I said, John, what was he saying to you? He said, finish it up, finish it up. Bayard always was impatient. But that speech was not so much about the dream. It was about Danville, and it was about Cambridge, Maryland, and it was about Jackson, Mississippi, and it was about Montgomery, Alabama, and it was about Eastland and Thurman and Wallace. It was specific, and there's a majesty in specificity.
Indeed. And with that, we want to thank you, Brother Jon, for writing this magisterial text. I want to thank you, the audience, for joining us for this conversation. And I know you're going to really love the book. I want to thank Brother Jamie for bringing us together in the Rancho Mirage Writers Festival.
Reverend Jamie. This is Virginia background.
Yeah, and we'll see everyone at the Rancho Mirage at the next Writers Festival. So we want to thank you, and everybody take care and stay safe out here. I appreciate you.
See you all soon. Thanks,
Take care,
Dave.
Jon.
Thanks, man.